1 squares are 1. 2 squares are 4. 3 squares are 9. 4 squares are 16. 5 squares are 25. 6 squares are 36. 7 squares are 49. 8 squares are 64. 9 squares are 81. 10 squares are 100. 11 squares are 121. 12 squares are 144. 13 squares are 169. 14 squares are 196. 15 squares are 225. 16 squares are 256. 17 squares are 289. 18 squares are 324. 19 squares are 361. 20 squares are 400. 21 squares are 441. 22 squares are 484. 23 squares are 529. 24 squares are 576. 25 squares are 625. 26 squares are 676. 27 squares are 729. 28 squares are 784. 29 squares are 841. 30 squares are 900. 31 squares are 961. 32 squares are 1024. 33 squares are 1089. 34 squares are 1156. 35 squares are 1225. 36 squares are 1296. 37 squares are 1369. 38 squares are 1444. 39 squares are 1521. 40 squares are 1600. 41 squares are 1681. 42 squares are 1764. 43 squares are 1849. 44 squares are 1936. 45 squares are 2025. 46 squares are 2116. 47 squares are 2209. 48 squares are 2304. 49 squares are 2401. 50 squares are 2500. 51 squares are 2601. 52 squares are 2704. 53 squares are 2809. 54 squares are 2916. 55 squares are 3025. 56 squares are 3136. 57 squares are 3249. 58 squares are 3364. 59 squares are 3481. 60 squares are 3600. 61 squares are 3721. 62 squares are 3844. 63 squares are 3969. 64 squares are 4096. 41
za
squares
40.
off 4,225.
42 za 80.
43 za
squares off
120.
4,356.
44 za 160.
405
67
za
squares
200.
off 4,489.
46 za 240.
47
za
squares off
280.
4,624.
48 za 320.
49
za
squares off
360.
4,761.
40 10s off 400.
71
squares off
41.
4,900.
71 squares off 5,041. 72 squares off 5,184. 73 squares off 5,329. 74 squares off 5,476. 75 squares off 5,625. 76 squares off 5,776. 77 squares off 5,929. 78 squares off 6,084. 79 squares off 6,241. 80 squares off 6,400. 81 squares off 6,561. 82 squares off 6,724. 83 squares off 6,889. 84 squares off 7,056. 85 squares off 7,225. 86 squares off 7,396. 87 squares off 7,569. 88 squares off 7,744. 89 squares off 7,921. 90 squares off 8,100. 91 squares off 8,281. 92 squares off 8,464. 93 squares off 8,649. 94 squares off 8,836. 95 squares off 9,025. 96 squares off 9,216. 97 squares off 9,409. 98 squares off 9,604. 99 squares off 9,801. 100 squares off 10,000.